The highway comes in and out of the fog like something half-remembered. A double yellow line, a guardrail, then nothing but gray. She drives with both hands on the wheel because the pull to the right gets worse when she's tired, and she's always tired now. The Ford's heater blew out somewhere around Coos Bay, and she hasn't had the money or the stillness to fix it, so she wears her jacket zipped to the chin and watches her breath cloud against the windshield and thinks about gas. 43 miles since the last station. Maybe $12 left. The math keeps coming up the same no matter how many times she runs it. Then the fog shifts. It pulls apart the way curtains do when someone walks through them in a hurry. And there it is, rising from the headland like a dark finger pointed at a low and colorless sky. A lighthouse, stone tower, no light, the keeper's cottage hunched at its base, like something bracing against the wind. A chain-link fence running along the cliff road, and a gate hanging open at an angle that suggests it's been that way for years. She doesn't decide to stop, she simply does. The truck idles at the shoulder, and she leans forward over the steering wheel, looking up through the streaked glass. The tower is dark. The windows of the cottage are boarded. A rusted sign on the fence reads, "Property of Oregon Coastal Authority, no trespassing," and the letters have faded to the color of old blood. No light, no sound except the ocean below and the engine ticking. She pulls through the open gate. October 14th, 1971. The last entry is written in a careful, unhurried hand. The penmanship of a man who has spent decades making records that needed to last. Wind from the southwest at 19 knots, ceiling low, visibility poor at the head, slightly better toward the South Channel. No vessel traffic logged since 1800 hours. The order came down from Portland last month, and I've been sitting with it ever since. Automated buoys, they say. Shore-based radar. The lighthouse is redundant now. I expect they're right. I expect a lot of things have gotten redundant that used to matter. I've oiled the lens housing. I've locked the lamp room. I've set the logbooks in the cellar with the weather instruments and the extra lamp oil because it seemed wrong to just leave them out. Someone will come back for this place eventually. Property like this doesn't stay forgotten. Last watch tonight. I'll walk down to the gate in the morning. I hope whoever reads this someday finds it in better order than it deserves. R. Aldrin, Principal Keeper, Cape Merrow Light Station, retired. He set down his pen. He believed it too, the part about someone coming back. He just didn't know it would take 24 years. The door had been painted once, a deep federal red that had since faded to the color of old brick, and the salt had gotten into the seams the way salt always does, patient, thorough, permanent. She wedged her pry bar into the gap and leaned her whole weight against it, and the wood gave with a sound like a held breath finally released. Inside, dark and cold and still. She stood in the doorway a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting the smell tell her what the darkness couldn't yet. Damp plaster, rust, something older underneath, wood smoke that hadn't moved in decades. Not rot, not ruin exactly, more like sleep. She stepped in. The front room was small and square. A cast-iron stove sat against the far wall, its surface dusty but uncracked, its legs still solid on the flagstone. She crossed to it and knocked on the side panel. A good, solid sound. The flue would need checking, but the body was sound. She filed that away. The plaster walls had bubbled in long horizontal streaks where the moisture had gotten in under the windowsills, and one corner of the ceiling showed a dark stain, shaped roughly like a palm tree, which she imagined had been spreading very slowly and very patiently for about 15 years. The floor was wooden planking, gritty underfoot, some boards soft near the south window but firm everywhere else. A cot frame leaned against the interior wall, its canvas long since collapsed and gone, just the iron skeleton remaining. She pressed the nearest joint with her thumb. No flex. Good iron didn't die just because you left it alone. The curtains on the seaward window were the saddest thing in the room. Salt bleached nearly white, thin as old paper, still hanging by 3 of their original rings. They moved in the air she'd brought in with her. She left them where they were. She moved through each room the same way she moved through any unfamiliar territory, slowly, touching nothing unnecessary, building an inventory in the back of her mind. A narrow kitchen, a dry sink, 2 wall shelves still holding a tin coffee pot and a glass lamp chimney, unbroken. A back room with a single window facing north toward the headland trail, which had probably been a bedroom. A set of stairs rising up into the tower. She didn't go up the stairs yet. She would. But right now she was cataloging the cottage, and the cottage was talking to her in the patient language of left-behind things, and she was listening. Enough to work with. That was the phrase that kept surfacing, quiet and deliberate, as she moved from room to room. Not perfect. Not easy. Just enough to work with. He packed 1 cardboard box. That was the sum of 22 years. 1 box. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the remaining items on the shelves and made himself be honest about what the Coast Guard would retrieve within the month. The first thing she fixed was the window. Not because it was the most urgent problem, the stove was the most urgent problem, but because the wind coming through the broken pane had an edge to it, a salt-wet edge that belonged to the Pacific and not to any interior she intended to sleep in. She found a piece of glass in the boathouse below the headland rocks, intact inside a rotted wooden frame that had given up the rest of itself to weather decades ago. She carried it up the path with both hands, moving carefully over the loose stones, and spent most of the second morning fitting it into the window frame with a bead of pine pitch she'd boiled soft over the camp stove. It wasn't a glazier's work, but it held, and the wind stopped coming in, and that was what mattered. The driftwood took 2 days of hauling. The beach below Cape Marrow had been collecting logs and planks and raw split timber for years, maybe decades, the ocean delivering material the way a river delivers silt. Without intention, without knowing what it was building toward. She stacked the wood against the cottage's leeward wall until she had enough to see her through the first serious cold snap. Her arms ached. Her boots were permanently damp. She stopped noticing. The iron stove was the hardest problem and the best victory. The flue pipe had rusted almost to nothing at the first elbow joint. She found a length of galvanized pipe in the boathouse, slightly too wide, and spent an afternoon persuading it into place with a rubber mallet and a strip of flashing bent by hand. She packed the gap with furnace cement she'd bought 6 weeks ago in Grants Pass for a job that had never materialized. When she finally set a match to the kindling, and the draw caught, and the heat began to come in slow, earnest waves through the iron body of the stove, she sat back on her heels and pressed both palms flat against the warming metal and held them there until the ache in her fingers began to ease. The cottage was not comfortable, but it was no longer ruin. He had been 19 when he first set his hand on the lamp room railing, and the cold of the iron had surprised him, the way anything that old surprises you when you realize it's still solid. He had come to Cape Marrow in the autumn of 1941, a government assignment he'd not thought to question. too young to understand yet that some postings were tests and some were gifts. He opened the first logbook the night he arrived and wrote in his careful, slightly formal hand, October 14th, 1941. First watch. The light feels like the loneliest and most necessary thing I have ever touched. I do not know if those two qualities can last together in a man, but I intend to find out. Then he closed the book and kept the light burning until morning. The fourth morning, she found her boot swallowed to the ankle before she understood what was happening. She'd been crossing from the stove to the window, mug in hand, not quite awake, and the floor simply gave. The rotten board collapsed inward, with a sound like a held breath finally released, and she grabbed the doorframe and held, tea sloshing across her wrist, heart hammering. When she looked down, there was darkness below the breach. Not the solid darkness of packed earth, but the particular emptiness of a space that had been waiting. She set the mug down carefully. Then she got on her knees. The hatch was iron, set flush with the subfloor beneath the kitchen boards, its ring pull so corroded it had seized into a single rough mass. She worked it for 20 minutes with the flathead screwdriver from her canvas roll, chipping rust free in orange flakes until the ring finally pivoted in her grip. The hatch came up with a shriek of metal against stone, and a breath of cold air that smelled of lamp oil and old paper, and something she could not name. Not quite cedar, not quite salt, something that belonged to sealed rooms and long patience. Stone steps. Narrow. She lowered herself carefully. 1964, March 27th, 5:49 a.m. He had been awake already. His back had been keeping him awake most nights that winter, the old complaint, and he'd been standing at the watchroom window with coffee going cold in his hand when he felt the barometer drop in a way that made him look at it twice. He tapped the glass. The needle didn't move. He went outside. The ocean was doing something he had not seen in 23 years of keeping this light. It was going. Away. Not retreating with a wave, withdrawing, as if pulled by something below the horizon, the water drawing back from the rocks in a long, slow exhalation, exposing tide pools that had never seen open air, leaving kelp draped across stone in limp garlands. He ran back inside and opened the logbook. Ocean pulled back a full quarter-mile. Barometer still falling. I know what this is. He kept writing even as he moved. The pen dragged across the page in urgent, slightly lurching lines. Had 18 minutes. Rang the bell until my arms gave out. She read that entry 3 times, crouched on the cellar floor with the logbook tilted toward the light from the hatch above. Around her, tide tables stacked in careful order by year. A barometer still mounted to the stone wall, its face dusty but the needle visible. Hand tools racked on wooden pegs, caulking irons, a spare lantern, a coil of copper wire, a life's careful accumulation, sealed and left. She looked at the barometer for a long moment. Then she looked at the logbooks still stacked along the wall. 40 years of entries, 40 years of watching, and she reached for the first one. She carried them up in 2 trips, arms full, the logbooks stacked against her chest like bricks. The cellar hatch banged shut behind her heel. Outside, the wind had picked up off the Pacific, pressing against the cottage windows in long, irregular gusts, and the lantern she'd set on the kitchen table threw a warm, unsteady circle across the warped wood. She started at the beginning. 1923. The handwriting was different then, rounder, more careful, the pen pressed hard into cheap paper. A different keeper, or the same one young. She skimmed the early years, storm logs, fuel consumption, visitor tallies, the occasional notation about a ship passing too close to the rocks. Meticulous, patient, the kind of attention that could only come from a man who had decided that watching carefully was its own form of purpose. By 1941, the handwriting had changed, tighter, faster, the letters leaning forward as if hurrying somewhere. The war entries were brief but present: blackout protocols, patrol boats, the strange quiet of a coast holding its breath. She read those pages slowly, then moved on. The 1964 entry stopped her the way a hand on the shoulder stops a person. March 27th, 5:36 in the evening. The ground moved first, just a few seconds, not violent, more like the headland shifting its weight. I'd felt it before. This was different. She looked up from the page. The lantern flame leaned sideways in a draft, steadied itself. Went to the watchroom. Barometer had fallen 11 millibars in 2 hours, which I had not noticed until that moment, and which I count as a failure of attention I will not repeat. Looked out at the water. The bay was wrong. The water was leaving, not a wave going out, not a tide, something below all of that, a withdrawal like breath being pulled back before a shout. I knew what I was seeing. I had read about it. I had written about the 1946 Aleutian wave in this same book. I did not waste time with doubt. I rang the bell. She could feel the urgency in the handwriting by then, the letters slightly larger, the lines less straight, a man writing and moving at the same time. Rang it for 11 minutes without stopping. Could see people coming out of their houses below, could see them looking up at the tower. Some of them started moving. That was enough. The wave came in at 6:02. I watched it from the watchroom window. It was not the largest wave I have ever imagined, but it was real, and it was fast, and it took the lower dock entirely. Everyone got out, every person. I wrote that down so I would not forget what the bell was for. She sat with the logbook open in her lap for a long time after that, the lantern burning low, the wind working steadily at the glass. Outside, the Pacific moved in the dark the way it always had, patient, enormous, indifferent. The barometer downstairs had a needle in it. She'd seen it herself. She reached for the next volume. She climbed the stairs the next morning. 97 of them. She had counted from the bottom once before, standing in the dark entry with her lantern, trying to guess how far they wound before the light gave out. Now she went up properly, one hand trailing the iron railing, the other holding the lantern out ahead. The stairs were cold and narrow and turned in a slow spiral that made the climb feel both longer and shorter than it was. Around the 40th step she passed a small window, just a slot in the stone, barely wider than her palm, and saw the Pacific out there, silver-gray under morning cloud. Around the 60th, her thighs began to burn. She kept going. The watchroom she had been in twice already. The logbooks, the instruments, the barometer with its nervous needle. She moved through it without stopping. The lamp room hatch was a low iron door, latched from the outside with a bolt so corroded she had to lean into it with both hands before it finally gave. Then cold salt air came pouring down from above, and she pushed through. She stood up slowly into a room made almost entirely of glass and light. The Fresnel lens floated at the center of it. Fourth order, she'd read that in the records downstairs, though the words hadn't prepared her for the actual fact of the thing. It stood roughly 4 feet tall in its brass cradle, prismatic rings stacked one above the other in perfect concentric layers. Each hand-ground panel fitted against the next, with the patience of someone who believed precision was a form of devotion. Every surface was coated in 24 years of dust and salt haze. It didn't matter. She could still see what it was. She put the lantern down and stood there for a moment just looking. Then she went back down for a bucket, a soft cloth, and a bottle of vinegar she'd found in the supply cellar, and she came back up and she began. She worked through the whole of that afternoon. She didn't rush. Each glass panel got its own time, breath on the surface first, then the cloth moving in slow circles, then her holding it up toward the gray window light to see if the haze was gone. The dust came off dark and mineral-smelling, decades of coast in it. Underneath was glass so clear it seemed to bend the light even standing still. She thought of the entry she'd read the week before, the young keeper's first posting, 1941. She had carried the line with her without meaning to. My hands would not stop shaking. The beam went out across the water, and I thought, someone is out there. Someone who does not know where the rocks are, and now they will. Outside, the clouds were beginning to thin. The lens caught the first pale break of afternoon sun and scattered it across the curved walls in long, wavering arcs. She kept cleaning. She heard the vehicle before she saw it. The crunch of tires on the gravel track below, slow and deliberate. The kind of approach that knows it has authority behind it. She was still in the lamp room. She didn't move right away. She listened to the engine idle, cut off, a door open and close. Then she set down her cloth and started for the stairs. The officer was already at the cottage door when she came around the tower base. A woman in her 40s, solid built, in a county uniform that had seen genuine weather. She was looking at the door frame, at the new mortar Lena had worked into the cracked stone. She looked at the truck. She looked at the swept path and the stacked cedar shingles and the window Lena had reglazed with a kit from the hardware store in town. She took it all in without expression, the way practical people take in information before deciding what to do with it. She showed Lena the document without preamble, a formal notice. Closure order, originally issued 1971, still active. No trespassing violation. She explained the terms the way someone explains a bus schedule. Not unkind, not apologetic, simply what was true. 72 hours to vacate the premises. All personal property to be removed. Continued occupation would result in escalated enforcement. Lena read it twice. The officer waited. "I understand," Lena said. The officer looked at her for a moment. She looked at the cottage again. She looked at the tower. She said she could see the place had been maintained, that she wasn't there to cause trouble. She said the order wasn't hers to revoke. "I know," Lena said. October 1971. The man who posted the closure notice was a county clerk, youngish, unhappy about the job. He'd driven out early because he didn't want anyone to see him. The last keeper had already gone, retired, moved inland to his daughter's house. His logbooks left in the cellar because there'd been a miscommunication about whether the county wanted them. The clerk pressed the notice flat against the cottage door and drove a nail through it. One clean strike. He stood back and looked at it. The salt air was already working on the paper's edges. He could see it happening in real time, the slight curl beginning at the corners, the ink going slightly dull where the moisture touched it. The lighthouse hadn't even been dark a full season, and already the coast was taking it back. He had not expected to feel anything. He drove away without looking again. Lena stood in the cottage doorway long after the officer's vehicle had disappeared down the track. She held the notice in both hands. 72 hours, 3 days. She looked at the lamp room window, 4 stories up, where the afternoon light was still scattering off the lens she'd cleaned panel by careful panel, still wavering across the stone walls up there, slow and searching, even now. She set the notice on the kitchen table she'd leveled herself, the one with the mismatched leg she'd shimmed with a folded piece of cedar shingle. She set it flat and walked away from it. 72 hours was still 72 hours. She would not spend it staring at paper. She went back down through the kitchen hatch and pulled logbooks until her arms were full. The keeper had been methodical in a way that felt almost devotional. Every entry dated, every instrument reading recorded in the same order. Barometric pressure, wind direction, sea state, visibility, notable observations. Decades of mornings reduced to columns of numbers, and yet reading them, she could feel him up there in the watchroom, lamp behind him, pencil moving, the ocean spread out below like something he'd been trusted to watch over. She read fast. She'd been reading in pieces, savoring it. Now she read like she was looking for something she hadn't known to look for before. The autumn sky outside was wrong. She'd noticed it that morning. A flat, yellow-gray color, not the deep pewter of a regular Pacific storm, something thinner and stranger, like the light was being filtered through gauze. The wind had died almost completely. The kelp smell off the water was stronger than usual, heavy and low. She went to the barometer she'd salvaged from the cellar and set on the cottage windowsill. She'd been watching it casually for days, the way you watch something out of habit. Now she watched it the way you watch something that is trying to tell you a specific thing. The needle had dropped, not a little, not storm drop. It had dropped farther than she had reference for, and she had driven through 3 serious weather systems in the last year alone. She went back to the logbooks. October entries, November. She was looking for any reading that matched what she was seeing outside. She found it in 1964. Barometric reading at 0600, 2991, by 1100, 2863. Pressure dropped like a stone before it happened. Sea surface glassy for 2 hours preceding. No wind. Sky the color of old brass. The ocean always tells you first. She read it again. The ocean always tells you first. The next entry, dated the following day, was brief. He had written it in a different hand. Slower, she could tell, the pressure of the pen lighter, like someone writing through exhaustion or shock. He described the withdrawal of water from the shore. He described the sound that came before the wave. He described what the wave did to the boats in the harbor below. He had counted things. He had done his job. She lifted her eyes to the window. The sea was glass flat. The color of the sky had not changed. The barometer needle had not moved back. She picked up the 1964 logbook and carried it up the stairs. She needed to see the water from higher ground. She climbed all 97 stairs with the logbook pressed against her chest. The watchroom was cold in the way that stone rooms are cold at dawn, not biting, just settled and permanent. She pressed her palm to the glass and looked down at the water. The sea was still flat, flat in a way that felt less like calm and more like held breath. She checked the barometer mounted on the watchroom wall. The needle had not recovered. It had dropped another fraction while she was reading downstairs. She tapped the glass. The needle shivered and stayed where it was. The sky to the south was that color. That exact color from the logbook. Old brass. She had thought it was just a phrase when she read it. It wasn't. She stood there for a long time, long enough to understand that she had already decided something, even if she hadn't said it out loud yet. The deadline was this morning. She had loaded half her tools into the truck the night before: the caulking knife, the pry bar, the folding saw. Her sleeping bag was rolled and cinched. The canvas duffel was packed. Everything she had brought fit in the truck bed with room to spare, because she had arrived with almost nothing, and she was leaving with almost nothing. The kitchen table she had repaired would stay. She couldn't fit it, and it belonged here anyway. She carried the logbook back down the stairs and set it on the table. Then she walked outside to take one last look from the headland before she started the engine. The morning air was still, no gulls. She had not noticed until this moment that there were no gulls, and that the silence wasn't peaceful. It was wrong, the way a room goes quiet when something has changed and no one has named it yet. She looked at the water. The ocean was pulling back. Not the ordinary recession of tide, not the slow creep of an outgoing current measured in minutes. The water was moving away from the rocks with visible speed, withdrawing like something being inhaled. Kelp beds surfaced in brown tangled sheets. Tide pools appeared that she had never seen, had not known existed, lying exposed now far below the lowest waterline. Hundreds of feet of bare rock and seafloor glistening in the flat morning light. Fish were stranded in the sudden shallows. She could see them from the headland. The silence that followed was total. She remembered the logbook entry without having to look it up. He had written it in 1964, and she had read it twice, and it was in her body now the same way cold water is in the body. The ocean always tells you first. She did not hesitate. She turned from the headland and ran. She ran to the truck and got it moving before the door was fully shut. The F-100 fishtailing on the wet gravel of the headland path, and then finding the coastal road and accelerating. She leaned on the horn. Not a warning tap, not a polite signal. She laid her palm flat against the center of the wheel and held it there, the sound tearing through the quiet morning air in one long, unbroken blare as she came down the switchbacks toward town. The road curved along the cliff edge, and she could see the harbor below her. The exposed seabed was visible even from this height, brown and glistening, impossibly wide, the dock pilings standing naked in open air where there should have been 12 feet of water. It looked like the ocean had simply decided to leave. She pressed harder on the accelerator. She hit the first residential street, still leaning on the horn, and when she reached the harbormaster's dock, she threw the truck into park and ran. A man was already outside, a heavy-set figure in a canvas jacket, standing at the edge of the dock and staring at the exposed mud and rock below him with an expression she recognized. Not confusion, but a particular, very old kind of dread. The face of someone who already knew what they were seeing and did not want to be right about it. She pointed at the exposed seabed and shouted only one word. He didn't ask questions. He turned immediately and walked with deliberate, heavy speed toward the air raid siren mounted on the dock's post, the old civil defense unit that had not been tested since the 1970s, and he threw the manual lever. The sound that came out was enormous, low and rising, filling the cove and bouncing off the cliff face and rolling through every street above the waterline. Lights came on in windows. Doors opened. She was already running. Door to door along the nearest residential street, banging with the flat of her hand, shouting the same words at every threshold, not waiting to see if they understood before she moved to the next house. She didn't need them to believe her. She just needed them to move uphill. Most of them did. Some of them stood in their doorways in robes and boots, staring toward the water with the same expression the harbormaster had worn, reading what they saw there with a generation's worth of coastal instinct, and then they turned without a word and started climbing. 18 minutes after the ocean had pulled back, the first wave broke against the headland below the lighthouse. She heard it before she saw it, a sound unlike anything she had language for, low and percussive and vast, felt in the chest more than the ears. She was already on high ground. She turned and watched the water come. The first wave took the lower dock entirely. She watched it happen from the hillside. Not the violent explosion she had imagined, but something more methodical and enormous, a wall of dark water that simply arrived and rearranged everything it touched, pulling it back into itself when it withdrew. The boathouse at the base of the headland was gone. The harbor master's smaller skiff, which had been tied at the near pier, was gone. The pier itself bent sideways like something made of cardboard. Then the water pulled back again, and a second wave came. She counted 3 waves before the sea began to settle into something resembling itself. By the time she made her way back down through the mud and broken branches to the coastal road, the enforcement officer was already there, standing in her vehicle's headlights beside the harbor master, both of them looking at the wreckage the water had left across the lower street. Shattered planking, a capsized outboard, debris pushed up against the wall of the fuel depot in a water line that came to chest height. The building was still standing, so was the depot, so was every person on that hillside. The enforcement officer stood with her arms at her sides and looked up, past the town, past the road, up the cliff face to the lighthouse on the headland. The lamp room was dark. The lens inside it was still, but she looked at it a long time before she said anything, and when she spoke it was quiet, more to herself than to the harbor master standing beside her. "Someone was watching," she said. Inland, 24 years earlier, in a house set back from a county road with no view of the water, an old man sat in a chair by the window that faced the wrong direction. His daughter had brought tea. She set it on the side table and watched him sit the way he always sat now, very still, hands on his knees, listening to something she couldn't hear. He had been retired 4 years. The lighthouse had been closed for 4 years. He understood the reasons. He had even agreed with them when they explained it to him. The Coast Guard would manage the coastline now. There were better systems, modern equipment. He still missed the lamp, he told her. Not the work exactly, the lamp. She asked him what he meant. He took a moment before he answered, the way he always did, measuring the words. "Someone has to watch the water," he said. "When nobody's watching, the water doesn't change. The water doesn't care. But someone needs to know what it's doing. Someone needs to be there who understands what it means when things go quiet." His daughter didn't answer. She sat beside him, and they both looked out the window at the trees. 3 days after the water came back, they brought the papers to the lighthouse. 2 of them, the county enforcement officer, the same practical, fair-minded woman who had handed over the eviction notice, and the harbor master, a broad-shouldered man who smelled of diesel and spoke in complete sentences when he bothered to speak at all. They came in the morning, when the fog was still thick against the headland. They knocked. That, in itself, felt significant. The table was set back from the window, solid and level, its cracked leg braced and re-glued with care. She had found it in the back room and spent an afternoon on it, not because she needed a table, but because it was there, and it was broken, and she knew how to fix it. They spread the agreement across its surface and explained what it meant. Caretaker, paid, permanent residency in the keeper's quarters, monthly obligation to log coastal conditions, report anomalies, maintain the structure. The Fresnel lens, they said, had been approved for reactivation. A coastal warning beacon. Someone from the Coast Guard would certify the fuel lines. She would be trained on the system. She read every line. Then she signed. The pen was the harbor master's. He recapped it when she handed it back, said something brief and genuine, and then both of them left her to the quiet. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the agreement with her name on it, sitting on the table she had fixed with her own hands, in the room where she had first slept on the floor. She climbed all 97 stairs. The Coast Guard technician was already in the lamp room, finishing the connections, checking the fuel valve. He nodded at her, packed his case, and went back down without ceremony. She didn't mind. She stood close to the lens, fourth-order Fresnel, original, intact, patient, and watched through the salt-filmed glass as the last of the afternoon dissolved into the gray edge of evening over the Pacific. The switch was a lever, old iron, stiff with disuse. She pulled it. The lamp woke. The beam was slow at first, gathering itself, and then it found its rotation and swept the water below in long, even strokes, reaching out past the rocks, past the cove, past the place where the ocean had drawn back and given its warning, and come thundering home again. It swept the whole dark length of the horizon, patient, steady, certain. She stayed in the lamp room a long time, watching it go. Down the coast road, in a house set back from the trees, an old man heard his daughter call out from the other room. She had seen something from the window. A light, she said, moving out on the water. Regular. He knew immediately what it was. He said nothing. He just closed his eyes and was quiet for a while, the way a person is quiet when something lost has finally been found.